Hello, thank you for coming to my talk, my presentation. I have been keeping an eye on educational trends for many years. And I have to say that open source learning is to education what the printing press was in the 1500s. So I want to begin my talk with a story. And this story is about a hole in the wall. So it happens in India, in a place called Delhi, in a slum, where a professor who's an education researcher decides to put a computer into this wall. This is way back in the 1999. This professor, Sugata Mitra, is from India, and he teaches at Newcastle University. And he was teaching a lot of students that were from wealthier backgrounds. And the parents would be bragging and my kid is so amazing with technology and computers. And he thought, well, I wonder what would happen if I put this computer out there for slum children, like street children, and see what happens. So he did. And then he walked away, came back after 8 hours, and to his amazement, the students were teaching each other how to browse. Now, these children are illiterate, they didn't know English, and they were figuring out, they were teaching each other how to use the internet. So he's like, how is this possible? It's not possible, I can't believe this. So what did he do but to go to a remote village in India and do the experiment again and again and again, and each time he found that the children were able to teach themselves how to use a computer. So for instance, he came back after a few months and the children came up and said, well, we want a faster computer, we want a better mouse. And why is it in English? We have to teach ourselves English so we can use this. So it was astounding. So with that in mind, that story, I just want you to hang on to that story because I'm going to refer back to it later on in the presentation. But I want to move on to the understanding of open source. And for many of you, I think there are many of you in the room that already get an idea of what open source is, just from the fact that it's associated with software, right? So, you can see the different logos that I've put here. I've used myself Linux, OpenOffice, and WordPress, all these different tools that you can use to share knowledge. So it was coined in 1998, I think in California. A woman actually coined that term, and I'm sorry, but I should have had her name because we don't have a lot of women's names in the open source movement. But so the idea was really to share content freely and to be able to modify code so that everybody could use that. So it's for the common good, the good of the community. There were 3 C's to open source. Code, as I just mentioned, with the examples of Linux and Apache. Collaboration, of course. So we could share tools. So the different tools would be like wikis and blogs and Flickr, those kind of tools that we're using nowadays. And of course, community, making it available to everybody. And Creative Commons is an organization, a not-for-profit that really promotes and enables us. You may see that logo because it's used a lot to license tools so that other people can use this. So that's kind of a bit of idea of where open source comes from. And now, when you take that idea, So the idea was then taken on by higher educational institutions like Massachusetts and MIT. They developed something called open course software, and they decided, okay, let's put these courses online. Let's just try and see what happens. At first, it was just for their own kind of community, and they started off in 2001 with around 50 courses that they published online. By 2008, they had 1,800 courses that were available to everybody. Anybody could go to the MIT site, to open course software, and use that material. And they were adding audio and visuals, and by 2012, I believe there's up to 2,150 different courses online that anyone can access, with over 125 million viewers users coming to utilize this. So it's actually happening everywhere. Harvard has it. Many universities are starting to open up their material. For instance, MIT, their words are empowering minds, unlocking. Just a second. What is it? I wanted to say that unlocking knowledge, empowering minds, and that's their motto. So you can see that already there was that trend towards opening things up. And so with open source learning, enabled by technology, you've got that spirit of openness, and we're starting to use it in the common parlance as an everyday word to describe learning and education that's not distinguished from life. So it's not new though. The thing is, open source learning is just a new term that's popularized an idea that's been around for decades, and I would say forever, because we're natural learners, and that's what we do. We learn in a community. I mean, you can take, for example, a baby. I think of my niece, and you try and say no to her, and you see what you get, right? It's like, no is not an answer, it's not acceptable. I want to do it, let me do it. That's what we do. We learn. We're good at learning. So the idea of open source learning is just kind of applying that lingo, that software lingo, to what's happening naturally anyway. You can see I placed a word here that you might not know, which is unschooling. I'm going to get to that soon. But there's one quote for open source learning that I love, and it's John Taylor Gatto. Some of you may know John Taylor Gatto. He is very well known in education circles because he's very funny and very clever, and he was a teacher for New York Teacher of the Year. I think he won 30. No, not that many, but he's been there for 30 years and won so many awards. And he actually did things differently under the radar. But he's a writer and a speaker, and I've actually had the honor of meeting him. But so this quote, open source learning allows everything under the sun as possible starting point on the road to self-mastery. So you're going to hear a few more quotes from my fan. I'm a fan of him, sorry. So open source learning defined again, everything under the sun is a potential lesson. Nothing is excluded automatically on the basis of age or test scores or official curricula, and everybody alive is a potential teacher. And I actually said even mass murderers, but I decided not to include that part there. So again, more together, you can see here's a picture of me. This was like in 2010, I think. My hair's shorter. So he came to Nipissing University in Brantford, and we actually recorded the show, and you'll hear more about that later. Open source learning, and I'm going to keep quoting because I really want you to understand that we're talking about a way of learning that nothing is standardized. The only tests allowed are performance demonstrations, not displays of memory. The student takes an increasingly active part in selecting and recruiting their own learning resources, establishing their own sequences and taking calculating risks and self-evaluating their own progress. This is radical thinking here. And the only goal, of course, is open source is being like a self-starter, a self-initiated, a self-directed person. And nobody can give you an education. I love this quote because I really understand it deeply, that you have to take an education. You don't get an education. It's up to you, the learner. So I'm going to talk about some key concepts of learning, open source learning. It starts with interest. So you begin with some kind of passion, some curiosity. There's discovery, inquiry, and exploration. I put different examples of something I'll talk a little bit later about tinkering and marinating in ideas, but that just basically means really deep thinking, delving into material, letting it stew a bit instead of rushing from one subject to the other. You're actually taking that time to let things kind of settle. And of course, you're empowering your learner. It's empowering to the learner because they have autonomy. They're not being told what to study and what to do. It's democratic. You can see that it's reaching from the example when I started off in India. These slum children, they're getting access to education, but a decade ago you wouldn't have. Two decades ago that would be impossible. Personalized, of course, and it often involves learning by doing. So you learn as you do, but not necessarily only. Other key concepts would be that it's messy. It's unpredictable. You don't know where it's going to take you. You've got to be able to have that trust in learning, and you can't do anything without being, I think anything creative, anything interesting has to be playful. There has to be an element of play, of, you know, some kind of, it's not all grim. So these are some of my personal understandings of open source. And of course, the hardest thing of all, if you have children, is trusting your child to be able to learn. But, you know, there's some people in the room here that have done that, and I'm one of those people. But we'll get to that. So, hang on a second. 1 second. That doesn't look right. Just a second. Maybe it is. So anyway, I'll just go with the slides. So, I will give you a bit of my background. I was a disgruntled student. I was always dissatisfied at school. I wasn't happy. So, as a kid in England, when I started off as a child, I remember, like, an example I can give is I really wanted to learn how to read, and I was reading, I was probably 5 or something, and I remember reading from a reader and getting the word away wrong. The word always sticks with me because that's how, you know, I'm grudgeful. But anyway, away, and I was hanging on to that word, and the teacher said, well, you didn't get that word right, so you can't get the next reader, you have to wait till whatever, the next day. And I thought, well, that's not fair. I know the word now, so can I get the reader? And she said, no. So I went over to the assistant, and I remember very well because I said, you know, I was determined, bound and determined to get the next reader. So I read, and she said, fine, you know, yes, you deserve the next reader. And I was then told I was being sneaky and cheating because I wanted to get the next reader. So that really, you know, infuriated me, and I can always remember that. Because then, you know, after I lived in Africa, in Cameroon, and I remember also having trouble at school and just feeling that I was just studying things I didn't want to study, but because people valued them more, you know, I felt obliged somehow to study that, and it didn't turn out well. I ended up being told not to come back to high school, and I ended up being a homeschooler myself. Like, I didn't realize it then, but I had to do my A-levels by myself at home, so I did. And even coming to Canada to, you know, study at McMaster, I still felt like, I wish there was some way that I could do something more, you know, do my own kind of research and my own work. And I ended up doing art because it provided more freedom for me. Oh, well, skip ahead, and I met my husband, and we had 3 children. There were 3. And by that time, I had been exploring what would it be like to be a teacher. And I realized, no, it didn't sit well with me. There was a lot of managing the children. I wanted to do something different. My husband and I thought, well, we could maybe raise our kids differently. We could do something where they could be more free, where we could preserve the creativity, where we could maybe, like, you know, just let them, they were telling us what they wanted to know, what they wanted to how they wanted to be in the world, and we were just following their lead. We're like, okay, you know, let's see how this goes. And we started reading books, like, hey, hang on a second. Oh, yeah, okay. That's good. So we're reading books, like, some of you may know John Holt, who's like he is a person who coined the term unschooling. And basically, unschooling is open source learning, but we didn't have the term at the time, right? So we thought, okay, unschooling, our kids we could preserve their creativity, their curiosity. We could do this and see where it goes from there, right? So they're all really close to the age of May as well, right? So I love this quote. Next to the right to life itself, the most fundamental of all human rights is the right to control our own minds and thoughts. That means the right to decide for ourselves how we will explore the world around us, think about our own and other person's experiences, and find and make the meaning of our own lives. I mean, that's really empowering and very difficult to believe that children can do this, can make those decisions, right? Of course, John Holt wasn't, you know, in a vacuum. He learned a lot from the badass Ivan Illich. Some of you may know some of his books. Deschooling Society was a book that really brought into public attention. He wrote Medical Nemesis, Gender, a whole bunch of other books. I feel like just a second, I want to check my notes, just 1 minute. I missed something, I missed an important quote here. No, it's coming up, this is it, yeah. So I really want to talk about, I want to quote directly from here because I think it's really interesting. So this book, This School and Society, he really gives examples of the ineffectual nature of institutionalized education. And most of us have been to school, and we kind of get, even if we enjoyed school, we kind of understand that there's something about being in school that's very counter, it doesn't feel right. There's something that you're being told what to do all day, every day, yeah. So anyway, Illich posited self-direction in education, supported by intentional social relations in fluid, informal arrangements. I want to quote this: universal education through schooling is not feasible. This is what he believed, it's just not feasible. Neither new attitudes of teachers towards their pupils, nor the proliferation of educational hardware or software, nor finally the attempt to expand the pedagog's responsibility until it engulfs his pupils' lifetimes will deliver universal education. The current search for new educational funnels must be reversed into the search for their institutional inverse, which are educational webs, which heighten the opportunity for each one to transform each moment of his living into one of learning, sharing, and caring. And Ivan Illich was a visionary for his time, and I think he would really be happy to know that, the internet has finally made that universal education possible. He hated technology, mistrusted it, and he wouldn't even use a telephone. He really believed that it was, we had to have face-to-face, communication. And I mean, he'd be turning over in his grave. I guess he died just at the advent of the internet. But he really believed it dehumanized people. But I believe that technology dehumanized people. But I really do believe that he would have approved of the internet, like in what you can do with the World Wide Web. Okay, so a little bit of fun now. Some people may know, who knows Pippi Longstocking? Yay, Pippi! Right. Astrid Lindgren's Pippi Longstocking, we really see her as a quintessential unschooling character because, she doesn't have parents in the story, but her lifestyle, the way she lives, the way she learns, the way she has adventures is really an example of what unschooling is and how it was like in our family anyway. It's like we didn't really do curriculum at all. So we tried because we'd get moments of doubt, but generally it didn't go very well when we tried. So we were really like Pippi, and this child was an exuberant, joyful child, open to the world and refusing any type of learning that was within the confines of a schoolroom. And she's like, there's altogether too many apples and ibexes and snakes and things like that. It makes me dizzy in their head. So it was like, a bit of a role model, if in a funny way, a tongue-in-cheek role model. I'm going to move on. So with these heroes at our backs, we could always refer to these writers, these people that we knew that were doing unschooling, open source learning, which I can now use. We thought that we could help our kids educate. We could help them educate themselves. So, here's an example here where there was a lot of community engagement. This is a car-free event where the kids were painting. I think it's 2001 or something. So we're having a street party here. Randy was always organizing parking meter parties, right? And so we just kind of put money in the parking meter and just take over the space. And that was just to raise awareness, not cause trouble, but to raise awareness that, the streets are for people. And we need to have more say in who goes through our neighborhood. So that was some examples. We would do a lot of hiking, a lot of reading, TV, well, not TV, but films, and discussions, a lot of conversation, and Radio Free School. Radio Free School, it was a radio show that we produced with our children for 7 years. And it was like the brainchild of Randy. He was used to doing community radio, and he thought, well, the radio station CFMU needs more content, spoken word content, and why don't we do a show? And this would be a way to engage, like have our children go out in the community, learn from all kinds of people, and then they had to come up with ideas of what they want to learn. That was part of it. Like, what do you want to learn this week? Who are we going to interview? And then we had so many generous people that would give us their time and share with us all this information, whether it was like belly dancing or astronomy, or I remember one show in particular that I loved, and it was a show where we got to talked to a scientist at Mac about ancient, like there was DNA, how you can extract DNA. It's better than extracting from blood, you know. And he talked about this here. Hold this piece of poo. It comes. It's like 2 million year old piece of poo from an ancient, like a cave in ancient, like in China, right? So that was an opportunity. Opportunities like that were just amazing for us and for our children, for their friends that we brought along to when we would do these shows. And then the shows would be broadcasted not only in CFMU, but open source. And by the way, we edited the material using open source software like Audacity. And that was then, you know, radioforall.net was the station, where it was housed, and then we were able to reach stations all across the country and even Japan. And so we also were able to interview advocates of this way of this autonomy in learning, this open source learning. What was I going to say? Oh, wait, yeah. So we did a blog, so there was an opportunity to kind of keep, like, to house where the shows were, and you can still listen to these radio shows. We still have them. You know, if you just go to this site, Natural Hormones Radio Free School, they're all archived there at radioforall.net. And then eventually we used this blog also just to keep you know, inform people about what we were doing, but also to just kind of document and write about these new trends in education. Eventually, this book here was the result of these interviews with advocates, such as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but you know, advocates like John Taylor Gatto, Pat Ferenga, Wendy Priestness, a whole bunch of well-known people that were advocates of this way of learning. I had all this information, the show wasn't running anymore, and I was like, well, what can I do with this? How can I, you know, popularize it? How can I make this use of this material? And I put a call out to my online community. People that I don't even know offered to help transcribe. And you know, if anyone's transcribed an interview, they know how horrible it is to do. It's really hard and long and boring. And so they were able to help me. I had maybe like 25 people, and some people in here did actually help edit. Way over there, edit the book. And through Create Space, another open tool, again, really fitting this whole movement. Create Space as I guess is a chapter of Amazon. Some people don't like that idea, but I did. You know. Anyway, so we were then able to make these interviews into chapters. The book was then, and I have copies of the book, $15, so you can get them online, Kindle version as well. Basically, the idea was that what is the theory behind this kind of education? How is it done? And then the last section was about kids that have grown up, they're now adults, and they grew up without school, and how are their lives like now. And so I'm really happy that I'm able to add this to Canadian resources. We've got, you know, this is just some examples of Canadian unschooling resources. And a quick plug for Wendy Priestness, who's a grandmother. She's a grandmother of home education, or what she calls life learning, because you're learning all the time. Or learning from life, or as you live, no distinction. So she basically said, you know, you can substitute home-based education to mean open source education. It's not an experiment, she says. It's how people learned to function in the world for centuries, and there is no reason to think people today can't do the same thing. School is the experiment, and not the lack of it. And I think the experiment is in trouble. Anyway, so here are my teens now. They are global citizens, they're social justice warriors, they're activists, artists, musicians, writers. They are, one of them is at Queen's University, the other two are at high school. Anyway, moving on. You know, at the beginning I talked about 3 C's of open source. I came up with 16 C's for open source learning of my own, and some of them include, well, this is what I've got: curiosity, creativity, coolness. Things have to be cool, or, you know, it's not going to last, the interest won't last long. Challenge, complexity, critical analysis, conversation, collaboration, connection, contribution. I love C. I've got more examples of open source learning, and I'm going to talk about these a bit more closely. So, let's go right to the next slide. Oh, okay, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit more about this too. Just a minute, I need to check my notes. Where is that? Okay, so curiosity, creativity, and coolness. We talked about that whole idea of starting from a place of interest. But there's also that idea of intrinsic motivation. So like, try motivating someone. Like if you're a teacher and you know how hard it is to motivate someone to learn, it's painful. It's really unpleasant to do. Like I know I've tried it and never like screaming, crying is just not nice. Right? So having that intrinsic motivation is really nice and important. And autonomy. We've been talking about autonomy all throughout, and it's really key. I just wanted to say something about creativity. So Sir Ken Robinson, I'm sure some of you have seen some of his talks on TED, and he says that creativity is not an option, it's an absolute necessity. And I really believe that. I think that we are heading into a world where we need to be really able to be creative and adaptable and nimble. There's a recent study that came out. Dr. Robert Bilder, he's a psychology professor at UCLA, and he says in any system there are forces pushing towards organization and others introducing unpredictability. A truly creative idea straddles both of these states, and he talks about creativity flourishing on the edge of chaos. You know, I talked about how things are messy. You don't know what you want. School kind of, we're trained to think about things being really, I do this is going to happen. I do that, but really, creative ideas. And I'm sure everyone here is real creative people, and we know that when we do create, we get to a state where things are very messy and chaotic, and not before we can actually evolve something half decent, a creative idea or art or whatever it is you're working on. And he talks about, for educators, embracing the notion of, having to have chaos in a tightly controlled classroom is disastrous. It's the worst case scenario. But Bilder has a reason for this theory. He tested it by asking children what aspect of a learning environment make them feel more creative. And one of the things they found most valuable in their art classes was the freedom not to have to seek right and wrong answers, Bilder says. It was that freedom to explore that led them to be increasingly engaged and allow them to forge connections that allow them to continue being creative. Right. So, how are we doing for time? Sorry. Never mind. Just keep going. Okay. So again, we talked a bit about challenge and the need to have something intriguing. To also, I think the best learning happens when there's actually a context around what you're learning. So you're not just learning in a vacuum. You don't know why you're learning this. I mean, I've got my kids at high school and they're like, I don't know why we're learning this. It's not relevant. So it's pretty sad that we spend so much time wasted our young people. It's just sitting there. It's just, I think it's a tragedy personally, but hopefully this, as open source learn, and I mean even Obama has said he wants to start using more open source resources in schools. So I don't know if that's actually going to affect directly what people learn, but there's some hope. Okay, so. I wanted to just say something about conversation, collaboration. I've grouped them together: conversation, connection, collaboration, and contribution. Education is relational. We are human. We're social. We like to spark off ideas off each other. So, but there's really something interesting that I just read from the London School of Economics. A recent another study that just came out that I think it was today. The emotional health of a child is more important than academics for future happiness. So they're measuring happiness, like what are the markers? What decides how you're going to be as an adult in terms of happiness? So you think that's obvious, but I guess it's not. People value money over, wealth over emotional, or academics over the emotional. So I just want to read here. He is the expert, UK's foremost happiness expert, Professor Richard Laird, and I have links if anyone wants to email me afterwards. He says that they did this test and this research, and they conclude that a child's emotional health is far more important to their satisfaction levels as an adult than other factors, such as if they achieve academic success when young or wealth when older. So there's something to keep in mind that you need to have that kind of connection, that relationship with whoever it is you're working with. I think it's something that is, in my experience, has been valuable. And a word on solitude, because we've been talking a lot about that kind of collaboration, connection, communication, and all that. You also need downtime. Let's face it, we all need to have that time to develop talent, creativity, deep thinking, personality. All these are important. If you're kind of pushed and pulled from all sides and you don't have that time to, I think it's a bit of a challenge too, before you can then re-enter into the fray. Here's a concept that's maybe new to you. Communities of practice and joint collective agencies is basically just the idea of people with common interests, whether online or offline, getting together in these new spaces that are representative of this new culture of learning. So kids and adults and different, they get together. It could be, I think of one of my daughters, she uses Tumblr quite a bit. And it's a wonderful community where they can really talk about gender issues, queer issues and such, and social justice issues especially. So there's a concept of the social justice Tumblr warrior that kind of has negative connotations in some circles, but really they're really actively engaged in thinking, discussing. I'm just amazed at what I learned from my daughter because through her community as well. And even before that, she was using an online community, DeviantArt, to share poetry and art and visual art. Some of you, story writing, some of you may have kids or you may do it yourself, but use that source, that resource. And so, once again, John C.D. Brown is someone I really recommend checking out. Some of you may know him. He has this wonderful concept of deep tinkering, marioneting. I think I talked about that earlier. And he was able to kind of, he started studying people that were doing that. He noticed, I think it was water surfing, surfers in, I think it was Australia or New Zealand. And basically they were learning. He realized that they were stepping up their game. Something was going on. They were learning, they were improving, they were becoming world champions. And how are they doing this? They were watching videos. They were kind of going out and practicing and collaborating. They had common interests and common goals, and when people are working that way, it's very hard to stop, that kind of energy. Oh, I just wanted a quick word on the local. I think that we often overlook our own communities where we live, being involved in what, in the community in whichever way you find interesting in your children or yourself, being active. I think that's also part of this open source education. Caring, giving a damn about where you live, right? So, I did mention the crowd-accelerated innovation, and that's kind of ties in with the collaborative communities I was talking about, communities of practice. The idea that a group of people, like a crowd, can actually move forward innovation. It's maybe something that we're not used to. We're used to the idea of a few people but with the internet and crowded innovation can emerge out of groups and has. I was watching the TED talk with Chris Anderson. I believe he's a head curator at TED, and he was describing how a kid was doing all these dance moves, and he was like a little 3-year-old, and basically he learned that from watching video as well. And the whole idea is that you can actually improve. You can step your game up because you're going to be more challenged when you see other people doing something that you like and you want to be as good. So that's kind of the idea behind that. I want a quick quote from that too. Chris Anderson says, for the first time in human history, talented students don't have to have their potential and their dreams written out of history by lousy teachers. They can sit 2 feet in front of the world's finest. So this is kind of where, and we all know, if you know anyone, like I have teens and I know that how much they learn just from being online, and it's almost like when they, there's such a distance from what they learn at school and then what they learn on their own. It just seems like so, I can't even explain it. It seems so old school. It's like I wonder why we're still so far behind as far as this whole idea of curriculum, and I'm hoping that things are going to keep changing. I just want to mention quickly the cycles of improvement driven by people. I just mentioned that already. And basically, who's a teacher? Everybody's a teacher. You're a teacher. We're all teachers. And yeah, it's a nice quote here. You're part of the crowd that may be about to launch the bigger learning cycle in human history. A cycle capable of carrying all of us to a smarter, wiser, more beautiful place. Oh, and there's another example of open source. Some of you may know about cultural labs. I think the one I know of is in France, and there's another model that's starting up in Cambridge. But basically the idea of a cultural lab is kind of like where we are right now. The idea is that cross-pollination of disciplines and being able to, some problems you can't solve in a conventional way from a lab, a conventional lab. You need art and science and digital media and everything coming together so that you can look at some of these problems. And these are some of the cultural labs that all around the world are happening. So Africa, Europe, India, everywhere. And we're sitting in one of them, a small scale one. More open resource examples. I've just put down a list. Some of you may know Khan Academy, that's an example where you can get all kinds of instruction online, TED Talks, museums, art galleries. It's personalized learning networks. I wanted to say a few words on that because we are all developing our own personalized networks, whether it's through LinkedIn or whether we have our own ways that we're doing this. Children and young people, they need to be helped to do that too, because in the end it's who you know, really. You need to, you need help with being in the world. That's the kind of support that kids need, right? Some kind of a real life mentoring. More examples, of course, the library is a model for open source. No one asks you a question. You're not asked. You're not tested. You're not questioned. You take out what you want to know about. You take out the material. Nobody challenges you or says, no, you have to pass this test or that before I give you this material. You're free to come and go as you will. It's very democratic. This is a beautiful example of open source. Learning centers, we have one in Ottawa that's opened. The Compass Center for Self-Directed Learning is for youth. We tried to do one in Hamilton very briefly, and we're not there yet, but we may eventually get to it. What else do I have? And there's a link here to crowdfunding community projects for education, which is an interesting way to do it. So because everyone's time is valuable, and you need to raise some money to do this. Another idea of open source is project-based work. Instead of, there's a school, for instance, this is one example of a school in California where the kids just work on a project all day, every day for months. There's no history, then French, then this and that. No, there's none of that. If we're working on a project, all the learning that we need is going to evolve or emerge from there. So we're solving questions and problems. Here's an example of, in the corner of my kids when they were younger, and they were doing zines, like little magazines, and they would go to small press fairs, and that was their project. They would just work on their projects and sell them and make a little bit of money, and it was fun for them. And now I'm going to go back to the idea, the story that I started off with at the beginning, with Sugata Mitra, the educational researcher. What happened after he installed those computers in the wall? He decided to do something called school in the cloud. I wish he didn't use the word school. I wish he had used something else, but anyway, school in the cloud is what he came up with. And basically, the idea is to do a learning lab where children can explore and learn from each other. No teachers present, because you remember this is like a real slum, there's poverty, and using resources and mentoring from the cloud. And how does he do that? There's something called, what he's called SOLs, self-organized learning environments, which is basically collaborations and encouragement, because he really believes that all you really need is encouragement. Children need to know that they can do something, they can be impactful, they can learn. And even if it's one person, one granny, which is what the next slide is, actually not the next slide, but the one after. The granny cloud, where basically they've paired up this school in the cloud with the granny cloud, so anyone can be a granny, male, female, old or young, but basically what they do is they encourage young people. They, maybe say, hey, that's a good idea, this is a good thing to discuss, or they tell stories, or they just like, it's just that connection, that relationship again. And this is a picture here of a group of nannies from the UK. So it's really about building that confidence in the children, and that's all they need, really. Because we're natural learners, we just keep remembering that. Why open source? Do I need to say why? I mean, the technology is redefining culture, culture is creating new norms, a new society. We've got these global issues that we have to worry about, climate change and degradation and the declining economy. We've got to think of useful solutions. We have to open up education, and I know that the school board here is trying to do that. It's very hard when you're in a kind of bureaucracy and you're institutionalized environment, but they're trying. We should give them our support, I guess. But to be relevant, we really need to stop teaching children like as if it was back in 19th century industrial revolution era, which is kind of what's still happening. We have to be aware that this is an age of participation, and we're all called on to be contributors, no matter what age you are. So, and for the young, why wait? Why I have my niece and nephew, and they're like, I'm a scientist, right? They believe already. Hey, I'm a scientist. I'm curious about this. Or I'm an artist. They don't need to wait until they're older. Right? Let's do it now. And so, what does this mean for the institution of schooling? I guess schooling is just going to eventually fade away. I think it's becoming less and less relevant. We know that we're learning all the time. It's difficult to hoard knowledge now. It's all out there. More and more, we're becoming more, intelligent. We've all got Google on the brain, and it's changing our minds as well. I think there's still credentialism around. It's going to continue, I think, but less and less so. Schools and universities are accepting kids who have not gone to school. They're actually accommodating those kids now more and more. U of T and all kinds of programs here in Canada. And I have, after in question answer, if people throw questions at me about famous people who didn't have all diplomas, I have a very long list. So looking into the future, what do we need? We need to be nimble, adaptable for the jobs of the future. I have a great list of over 152 jobs that we have that will be in the future. Basically, these jobs that we're teaching children to be prepared for are not going to be. They're obsolete. They're on the way out. So we need to be more current. We need to be aware of what's going on. I've got a lot of links. If people want to ask me if they want this presentation, I can send it on. And I think I'm going to conclude with a quote. Where is my quote? Again, my favorite, John Taylor Gatto. Nobody can give you an education. You have to take an education, and that means taking here, there, everywhere from the world around us, according to what we are interested in, passionate about, and not what someone prescribes for us. So with that, I ask you all to, these are some more slides, but they're just resources that you can look at. And so you can, just the last slide here I've got, don't forget to be awesome. And I want to thank you for listening in, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.